Chris is here today to answer the classic questions of what, where and when to buy property and how to do it with the least amount of personal effort. So please join me in welcoming Chris Gray.
I started off my life in the UK. My father was a heart physician, studied at Cambridge University. So as he always said to me, son, I'm a lot cleverer than you're ever going to be. And this is how I grew up. And I wasn't that academic. But we never talked about money around the table. It's always seen as a bit of a dirty word, isn't it? And I think even in Australia now, and especially around workplaces, quite often you can't talk about money because it's like a sackable offence. But what I started to realise as I got into my late teens was my dad was earning more money from his one family house than he was from his job. So I started to think, and I thought, if I'm never going to earn as much money as my dad, because he's obviously more cleverer than me, because he keeps telling me, rather than have one job and one house, why not have no job and two houses? Because you make more money. And if you could have no job and two houses, why not have no job and 3, 4 or 5, or even 10, 20 or 30 houses? Now that sounds a bit of a strange concept, doesn't it? But that's basically what I did. So at 22 I bought my first property, 23 I bought my second, then came to Sydney, Australia, almost the best place in the world, apart from when you have the storms in Sydney and you come up here and it's steaming hot. Nice place, Brisbane. Bought my third, fourth, fifth, sixth property, earning $80,000 at Deloitte, so as accountants we don't always get paid a fortune, do we? And I had to work 40, 50 hours a week for that. At the same time, during the early 2000s, through the property booms, I was earning $600,000 a year from doing nothing, just holding these 6 properties. So they're roughly growing at 20% a year in those days. And so that's when I took a bit of time out. So I took about a month out over Christmas and I tried to justify my job. And I'm very glad, being an accountant and good at figures, I couldn't justify my job, and so that's why I gave up. And the whole idea was, naturally I'm quite lazy, and so my thought of earning 300 to 600 grand passively from doing nothing, sitting on my backside waiting, rather than turning up as an accountant, for me it just didn't ring my bells. But I understand for some people then they do like accounting and it's a good profession and your parents are proud and all the rest of it. So what I want to do, or basically what I've done since then, is just to finish off the story, is people couldn't understand why I had these flash cars, why I was living on the beach, why I didn't have a job and all this kind of stuff. So I started teaching people. And the main reason that people asked me and that they believed what I said was because I didn't have a job, I didn't have anything to sell. So I wasn't a mortgage broker selling mortgages, I wasn't a financial planner, I wasn't selling property, I wasn't selling anything. So I had no vested interest in putting them in the wrong way. And that's why they believed me. And that's why I then started doing TV stuff. And then from there, then people said, look, we don't want to learn how to do it, we haven't got the time, we'll just pay you and you go off and do it. Okay? So now we roughly buy 1 or 2 properties a week. We do about $10 million of renovations, which when you're doing about 60 or 70 grand renos, is quite a few renos. But again, it's all pretty passive. So if you're hardworking already, you can still make a lot of money without obviously having to go through that. Now, probably the next 10 or 15 minutes for some of you might feel a bit fluffy. Yeah, have you been on any of those courses, some of the goal setting, the namby-pamby fluffy rubbish? And as accountants, quite often we like the hard numbers. The next couple of slides are actually going to be the most important slides in the whole presentation, but probably now and probably maybe even a year's time, you'll be thinking that was a load of rubbish. What you'll find is maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, you'll actually look back and say that was the most important slide. Now, a lot of people say to me, okay, what's the most important thing? For me to be successful in property, and we had a bit of a chat outside with some of the audience, what's the most important thing? Is having rich parents, is that going to help me? Well, yes, it will. Is having a good job with a good income going to help me? Well, yes, it is. Is having a big deposit going to help me? Yes. Is knowing where the best place to buy? Is negotiating? All of those big things. But none of those are the most important thing. The most important thing is that. And what it is if you've ever been on goal setting type things, is if you're going to change where you are now to where you want to be, you're going to have to go through change in your life, okay? And that's going to be painful, and there's going to be sacrifice. And ultimately, the things that get these Olympians up at first thing in the morning is ultimately having that dream that's a real willpower to go off and do something. Because when you're studying accounting, or when you're doing accounting, you're doing lots of big hours. To invest in property to start with, you've got to put some time and effort in and put some money behind it. And even though I can't draw pictures, as you can well see, and a 5-year-old could probably draw a better picture, to me it means something. And so the whole idea is if you draw this picture, and we obviously haven't got time to do it tonight, but if you take the time, and believe me, it is worth the time, to actually go and do something like this, when you're going through the pain at first thing in the morning, or last thing at night, or you read in the paper that interest rates are going to go to 20%, or you have these scares during your journey, this is the thing that makes it last. Okay? So this really is the most important thing. That is the key to making money in property. Not that probably 90% of people will kind of realise it. Okay? Now, quite often they say, if you want to see how wealthy you're going to be in the next 10 years, look at seeing how much wealth you've created in the last 10 years and double it. And that's a sign of how wealthy you're going to be. So if you're 30 now, that's how wealthy you'll be at 40. How many people would be really happy if they duplicated what they did in the last 10 years? Only a couple of little hands sneaking up there. So again, some people will, some people won't. Some people will need to go through massive change. And this is what I want to try and take you through tonight, is some of the mindset change, but then also the physical thing about buying the properties. And again, try and believe me in what I say is, trying to get your mindset right is the hardest thing. Buying the properties, getting the mortgages, renovating, waiting, putting tenants is easy. It's a no-brainer. The mindset is the toughest thing, okay? So, for most people, they don't like change. And most people will only go through change if it's forced upon them with a massive hammer. Now, what are examples of some of the things where people have gone through massive changes? And you'd know it from the workplace and things like that. What are some examples of people going through big change in their life? And as they say, this is Australian speaking, isn't it? Like, I know I'm from Sydney, I know I'm from the UK. The idea of interaction will actually help you. What about things like cancer? Does cancer change lives? Yeah. For good or for bad? Generally for bad, isn't it? What about things like redundancy? Yeah. You guys have had the floods. Yeah. Pretty bad thing. What else have we got? Divorce. Yeah. Pretty bad thing. Unless you're a lawyer. Or it depends what side that you're on. If you're, and it's not necessarily husband and wife, it could be the other way. So lawyers are guaranteed to make money from the divorce. Husband and wife, it depends on who's got the most expensive lawyer. So generally these kind of things, are they positive or negative events? Generally negative, aren't they? But do you see that sometimes, quite often, they turn positive? There's a guy, Tom Panos, that comes on my Sky show, who had cancer quite a few years ago. He now is one of the fittest guys at 45 that you'll ever see, because he got over cancer. He's now changed his life. He values his life, and he's out at the gym at 5 in the morning every day. If you look at redundancies at Deloitte, I interviewed 1,000 CFOs that all earned 6 figures. A lot of them were accountants, and they thought they liked being accountants. They then got made redundant, and the whole world collapsed. 6 months later, they said, that's the best thing that ever happened for me, because I'd never have given up accounting, because I was in my security blanket. I've now found there's another world out there. And I'm not trying to get people away from CPA Australia or anything like that. Divorces. A lot of people, like the kids, will say, Mum and Dad are actually happier now because they've both found other partners and they've kind of moved on in their lives. Now, for most of those examples, would like that Tom Panos have ever gone down to the gym at 5 in the morning if he didn't get cancer? Probably not. Would the person that got made redundant never leave accounting? Probably not. It's only because it's been forced upon them that people actually do make those changes. And so this goes back to this thing here. This is what we call the why. why is the reason that you've turned up tonight? What are you looking to change, and how strong is that reason? Because whatever I say in the next 40 minutes is irrelevant if the why is not big enough. Now, to give you an idea of my why, I've got a couple of whys. When I was a kid, even though my parents were reasonably well off, they had some stupid idea that their parents had taught them that they shouldn't give money to their kids, the kids should earn a living. So I wanted to go to school in a Porsche, but I couldn't afford it. My parents wouldn't give it to me. So I had to work out, I've got my own way of trying to do it. So I was quite materialistic. But I was also scared about being poor, because I thought if I'm poor, then I've got no choice. I've got someone dictating what I do all the time. So I'm pushed away from being poor and having no money and no freedom, no choice, and I'm pulled towards having the material things, okay? That's all going to be different for different people. The whole idea is you need to find out what your motivators are, what's going to get you out of bed, because that's the thing that you need to turn to actually kind of go and make that difference, okay? Does that make sense? And again, if I'm speaking a foreign language, just put your hand up and ask a question. I'll try and translate. Now, quite often in business, we are always taught about to try and leverage our time and money, the business's money, as much as possible. So we go on these efficiency courses. And generally in business, most people are reasonably efficient. When it comes to your personal life, how good are you with your time and your money away from work? Again, maybe a show of hands. How many people are really good with their money and good with their time? Not a single hand. Okay, why is that generally? Why do you think that is? Are you kind of stuffed after work, like you've done 60 hours, you've had enough, you want to sit on the couch? Who here wants to do a budget after doing budgets all day? No one. How many of you have done your tax returns on time at the last whenever? Accountants are supposed to be the worst. Generally we don't. It's the worst thing that we do. The thing that really pushed this for me is when I was at Deloitte, one of my colleagues used to say that on a Saturday morning, they used to spend, her and her husband used to spend the whole day cleaning the house, or the whole morning cleaning the house. In the afternoon, they used to go out shopping, doing all the groceries and the rest of it. I said, lucky husband, hey? Spend the whole Saturday doing the house and the rest of it. And I'm saying, like, why would you waste, especially when it's so valuable, especially after studying accounting, why would you waste a whole day when you only get 2 days off doing that kind of stuff? Because how many people have been here to, how many people here have been to an Amway seminar? Yeah? Did you realise this is an Amway seminar now? We actually convert it halfway through. No. One of the very, very clever things with Amway is what they teach you is 80% of the things that you buy week in, week out is the same stuff. It's the same toilet paper, it's the same toothpaste. How much pleasure is it in buying that kind of stuff? None, because it's the same stuff. So their philosophy is why go and spend all those hours at the supermarket, stacking up the car, taking all the shopping up the stairs and the rest of it, when for $10 you can pay someone to deliver it? Mine's the same philosophy. So for my friend there is, why go and do all that stuff when for $10 you can get it all delivered? Again, why spend half a day cleaning your house when you could pay someone $20 an hour, maybe $25 an hour to go and do that? You're better off spending an extra hour at work or 2 hours at work to then pay for that whole day of stuff, and you suddenly free your whole day up. Okay? But in today's society, how many people would feel guilty putting their feet up on the couch when they've got domestic help running around the house cleaning up under them? There's quite a few nods. Because we're brought up that if we want to get rich, you get rich by looking after the pennies look after the pounds. Make sense? Whereas I think that's completely wrong. Because I think if you earn 100 grand and you pay, what, 30 or 40 grand in tax, you earn, say, like 60 or 70 net, you can only get richer by 60 or 70 grand a year. Because that's all the money there is. Whereas I don't think there's any money, there's a limit on how much you can save, but there's no limit on how much money you can make. So I spend my whole life trying to spend money, because as I spend money, I call it investing. And I'm either leveraging my time or leveraging investments. So if I have a shocking month and spend lots of money, I think that's really good because I must have invested a lot of it and that money's coming back later on. So it's a different mentality of doing it. Obviously cars and handbags and the rest of it doesn't really, but we'll get on to that later on. When I was younger, I thought that the more money you earn, the richer you get. Is that true? How come?
Spend it.
You spend it. Do you have better clothes, better cars, better bottle of wine, better holidays? because especially as accountants, so I can relate to the accountants thing, I remember like I studied kind of full time and worked full time, so I did kind of 40 hours work and like 20 hours study, so 60, 70-hour weeks. And time was obviously pretty precious. So when I went out at the weekends, I deserved to go out to a good restaurant. I deserved to have a good car, good holiday, good house, because I've worked hard. And that's the way it is, and the bills kind of suddenly get up. But it doesn't really work that way, does it? What I found at Deloitte's was that generally most of the people that earn six figures generally work 40 to 60 hours a week. They generally didn't spend any time with the wife and the kids, or the husband and the kids, as it might be. And generally they'd use that money to then try and compensate by having the big houses. And if you get up to like $250,000, $500,000 income and you lose your job, how easy is it to get another one of those jobs? Pretty tough. And you've still got that spending ability. So again, I'm not trying to depress everyone, but it's what we're trying to do is just trying to have a bit of reality, because as an accountant, I was always told, keep trying to get a pay rise, keep trying to work yourself up the ladder. What I learned from Deloitte is all these people at the top of the ladder didn't have what I wanted. And I was glad to learn that at 30 rather than wait till 65 and then look back in hindsight, as a lot of our grandparents do, and say, if I'd had my life differently, I would have done something else. And that's all I'm into is just trying to bring reality kind of a bit closer. Okay, we'll get into some of the media financial stuff now. When my father retired, probably about 70 or 80% of his net assets was his family house. So all the money he had from his wages, superannuation, all that kind of stuff, didn't actually relate to a lot of his net wealth on retirement. And I think that's true pretty much around the world. Most of people's net wealth is in their family home. How good is the family home as an investment if that's what most of you are going to retire on? Good or bad? I mean, like Robert Kiyosaki, you heard of Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad? He actually said your house is a liability, because a liability actually takes money out of your pocket. Your house costs you money rather than makes you money. But it still goes up in value, doesn't it? Is borrowing money on your house a good thing? So like we get into debt now. So we use debt in our businesses, and that's always seen as a good thing. Debt in business is good, yeah? When it comes to personal debt, is that good or bad? Generally bad, because say our home debt is non-tax deductible, isn't it? The accountant should be getting thrilled about this kind of stuff. Yeah, you are an accountant. We have got CPA Australia, haven't we? Yeah. What about debt for cars? Is that a good thing? Come on, guy. This is when the guys nod, and then we say, is debt for handbags and clothes a good thing? This is where all the women nod. Obviously not. So generally things for luxuries and stuff like that, it's not seen as good debt, is it? Do you reckon that's right, though? This is where we get into the contrarian bit. Quite often, people pretty much follow the crowd. They do the same as pretty much everyone else has done, haven't they? Most people reasonably follow their parents, parents follow their grandparents. Is that right? So the old way of thinking is put yourself to work. You only deserve to come back home and hold your head up high if you've done a good day's work. But is now maybe the expression, put your assets to work? Is that a different philosophy? Again, everyone always says that you should pay off your debts, reduce your debt, and then you can retire. But is it potentially now the complete opposite? Is it actually increase your debt? If you want to retire, you've got to get more into debt. Starts fun at 65. You know, the old philosophy was at 65 you do you travel the world, don't you? You go and do your big world tour? Or is it maybe life starts now? Again, the parents said buy when you can afford to buy, so don't borrow money to go and buy things that you can't afford to pay for in cash. Or now is it maybe can you have your cake and eat it? Let me tell you another story. When I was 4 years old, I had exactly the same haircut. It's changed over the last 30 years, but it's gone back to where it was before. It happens sometimes. At 4 years old, my parents bought their main family house, and they still own that house. It cost them £30,000. Pounds, dollars, doesn't really matter. Over the next 30 odd years, it grew to be $1 million. Okay? Now, they did what everyone else did, and they paid off that debt. So at the age of 65, they got £1 million or $1 million asset, and it's all paid off. Would you agree that's how most of us invest around the world? Yeah? And why do we pay off that debt on the family house? Because it's non-tax deductible. Isn't that what our accountants say? maybe not you as accountants, but maybe your accountants say that. It's non-deductible, so you should pay it off. And again, we can give slides to this, so you don't necessarily need to write it down. A lot of it's in the book. What if they went against their advice? What if rather than pay off their home loan, they bought the house next door? Now, if the house next door is exactly the same house, roughly, costs 30,000, should that grow to be $1 million over the next 30 odd years as well? We're talking big picture here. Okay, but most people can't afford one house, let alone two, can they? So what if they decided to go interest only, so they're not paying back a single cent of the mortgage, and so the mortgage repayments are less, and they've got rent coming in. So let's just say the rent paid the mortgage. Over the next 30 years, they both grow to be $1 million. So at retirement, they're then 65 and they've got 2 million of assets. But they've got no job, they've got no income coming in, and they're $60,000 in debt. If that was you, would you be worried? No, because what could you do? Sell one, pay a bit of tax. How much tax would you pay? $1 million, 250? Yeah. See, I mean, I was a bad accountant, but I know some of the numbers. So you maybe pay 250 in tax, you're still $1.7 million up. So the question is, do you want to be tax efficient and pay off your house and be tax efficient on 30,000, or do you want to concentrate on making another $1 million? Let's make it slightly more complicated. When you buy investment property in Australia, does the rent pay the mortgage? Generally doesn't, does it? When I started investing in the UK, we used to get about 11 or 12% rent returns. We'd then pay, say, 7% interest, so we'd make 4 or 5%. But when you're in the UK, you Australians are kind of upside down, aren't you? You're a bit different. For some reason, you go and buy an asset, you go and tie yourself to it with a 30-year lease or a 30-year mortgage, you go and rent it out to a stranger that you never even met, and you charge him half the price of what it costs you. Now that makes financial sense, doesn't it? I couldn't understand it. Everyone in Australia, I met all these professionals in Sydney when I came over like 12 years ago, and they said, oh no, we don't buy it, it's cheaper to rent. And I said, how can it be cheaper to rent? Why would someone rent you a house at half the price? But that's the way you Australians do it. I still haven't worked it out, but that's the way it goes. So, let's just say they couldn't afford the difference between the rent and the mortgage. Let's just say they went down to their friendly bank and they said, right, we want to pull some equity out. So we're assuming there's a bit of equity in the property, or it's grown for a few years, or they bought it well. And they pulled some of the equity out and they used that equity to cash flow the difference between the rent and the mortgage. Okay? Now, on a $30,000 property, the difference between the rent and the mortgage is going to be peanuts, isn't it? It's maybe like $1,000. Yeah? But compounding interest, interest on interest, never paying it back, let's call it they borrowed 10 grand a year for 30 years, okay? To make it a worst case scenario. So, over 30 years, they've borrowed $300,000. So again, the question is, at the age of 65, you're sitting on 2 million of assets, but you're now 360 in debt. So 360 is a reasonable mortgage now. Would you be worried? A few less no's. So what could you do? Sell it, pay the tax, and you're still effectively $1.4 million up. So again, the question is do you want to be tax efficient on 30,000, or do you want to concentrate on making the mill? We've got one more go on these. Now, we said before that borrowing for luxuries isn't a good thing, is it? Do you reckon, would you be happy if I can disprove it so you can go out and buy some luxuries? Yeah? And you can justify it. And I justified this in the Telegraph on a Ferrari. I'll tell you how we did it. So, let's just say you go down to your bank again and you say, we want to borrow some of the equity out and we want to spend it on luxuries. And by coincidence, when I came to Australia in '97, there was a Commonwealth Bank ad that said, spend your kids' inheritance. Does anyone remember that? It went on for a long time. Lucky my parents never saw that. So they never spent the inheritance. So, same kind of philosophy though. So let's just say they borrowed 10,000 a year for 30 years, so they borrowed 300 grand. Now is that 300 grand tax deductible? No, because it's on luxuries, isn't it? But does it really matter? So over 30 years, they're now 660 in debt. They've got no income, only half the debt's deductible. Would you be worried? Sell the house, pay the 250 in tax, whether it's deductible or non-deductible debt, and you're still $1.1 million up. So to summarise, and look, this is big picture, and we'll go into some of the assumptions. You've basically, rather than paid off your house, you've bought a second property. You haven't paid the difference between the rent and the mortgage because you've taken it from the equity, so it hasn't cost you a cent from your wages. You've then gone and blown 300 grand on luxuries that you couldn't afford, which is non-deductible debt. You've sold the house, paid the tax, paid the agent maybe, and you're still 100 grand up. Reasonable plan?
As long as house prices.
Exactly. So this is the thing. Should you ever listen to a POM at the front of the room and go off and implement something the next day from a seminar? Definitely not. Not even at CPA Australia. Even though they get very good speakers here. What's the biggest assumption? He said it. Is property going to rise? Does this work if property doesn't rise? No, it doesn't. The assumption is property is going to rise. Will property always rise year on year? No, history's shown it hasn't. Generally, if you buy residential property at a median price, so the average price, around the main cities, and you look at a 10 to 30 year plan, does property generally rise in time? Yeah. If you don't think it does, should you buy it? No, buy some shares because they've got no chance of dropping 50%. They're secure as anything. That's a bit of English sarcasm, by the way. Okay, what are some of the other assumptions? What else can change in here? What about interest rates? Are they going to change in 30 years? Could they be 20% again? Sure, they could be. Could they be down at 1 or 2%? Yep. Tenants, are they golden little angels that always pay the rent and never trash the house? No, they're not, are they? Are you going to have to maintain the house in the next 30 years? Yep. Are there going to be new taxes that come in? Yeah, land tax, some other tax that we've never even heard of that some clever accountants thought up. Sure, there's bound to be one. With all of those things that we've talked about, do you reckon you can put a worst case number and a best case number and an average case number on every single one of those things that we talked about? You could, couldn't you? So like rent, you could say minimum 2%, maximum 4%. Capital growth could be minus 20%, minus 30%, and then maybe plus 10 or 20. So as accountants, if you Excel'd it, or if they've got some clever thing of doing it that's not Excel these days, do you reckon you could put a scenario on those kind of things? Yeah? How much emotion should be in that decision of whether you do it or not?
0.
How much is there? Masses. Yeah? Because if you look at most of the property speakers around the country and around the world, a lot of them are accountants. Why are accountants good at making money from property? How much emotion have accountants got? You answered it yourself. How much emotion should there be? 0. How many have accountants got? Maybe there might be some accountants with some emotion out there. Okay. The big assumption though is obviously property isn't grown value. Quite often they say median price residential property close to the cities roughly grows at 7 to 10% a year. Okay? So if you took a property, say from my parents' age, from 30,000, double to 60 to 120 to 240, they just slightly beat the average over that 30 odd years. So I think their property was worth 1.2, 1.3 or something like that. Now if you take an average property in Australia now at $500,000, who reckons in 35 years an average property, maybe the property you're in at the moment, is going to be worth $16 million? All honesty, hands up if you do. Not a single hand. What about half of it, say maybe 8 million? Any hands? Couple of nods, couple of little hands. How much was 30,000 30 odd years ago? I mean, how much was a pound worth a year ago? 2 years ago, it was a lot of money. Not anymore. 30,000 was a massive amount of money. Everyone said my parents, like, they geared beyond belief and the rest of it, and the house had subsidence, so they thought it was going to be at the bottom of the hill by 30 years. It's still there though. A lot of money. Even when I was probably 17, I knew one millionaire in our village. He used to play at the tennis club, had a white Porsche. You would never dare go within a metre of the Porsche, let alone try and speak to the guy. Because a millionaire, when you're a little kid, was a seriously wealthy person. What's a millionaire these days? Not a lot really, is it? It's more now, probably 10 million, isn't it? 10 million is a rich person. So, who knows if it's going to be worth 60 million in that time? but that's typically what's happened. They actually said, I think there's a statistic, 1066, Battle of Hastings in the UK, property has risen 7 to 10% since then. But then 97.2% of statistics are made up. So look, it's up to you if you want to. So there's a few people catching on the jokes, isn't there? Who knows? If you agree with it, buy it. If you don't agree with it, don't buy it. You'll be stupid. The only reason I got into property is I thought it's short supply. I need somewhere to live, so does everyone else. I buy by the main cities, there's no more land, and that's as simple as I get. And on Sky, I get the head of Residex, Australian Property Monitors, RP Data, SQM Research, all of the heads of all the top research companies, and they come out with all this stuff and ratios to income and all this kind of rubbish that they spill around the world. And then they say, yeah, but the one thing that overrides it is if you're buying around the main cities, there's no more land, there's loads of affordability, they don't have those issues, and so prices go up. So I buy a lot around the eastern suburbs in Sydney, so like the Bondi Beach, Coogis, you know those names. Parents give the kids a couple of $100,000, here's a deposit. We met a Korean guy who was about 22, about 2 months ago. He had $1 million to invest in cash. And we said, how much are you going to leverage on that? Like, what do you earn? I don't earn anything. It's like, how can you compete buying with that? Has he got an affordability issue at 22? No, and you think it's a one-off, but I go down, I live near Double Bay. I go down there, I'm paying with my $50 note. There's a little 18-year-old girl with a gold card and a $100 note. And it's, whether you agree with that or not, there's people with money around the world, and that pushes prices up. Not so much in the outer areas, I believe, but certainly around the city areas where, I mean, we're in a recession, or we've been through recession. Have most people still got jobs? Most of your friends and family, professionals around the inner city areas, have most people got jobs? Generally they have. Okay, let's very quickly work through some break-evens. So the big question is, what does property have to rise by in order for you to make a profit? Okay, so we'll do these reasonably quick because you're accountants, you're good with numbers. Again, these are in the book. 500 grand property, you're probably going to get $450, maybe $500 a week rent, but then you'll probably pay about 1% on expenses. So you roughly get about $400 a week. Now again, use this as a formula. So if you disagree and you think you'll get more rent or less rent, you put in your own numbers and see what the number comes out for you. Okay, so I'm not dictating to say these are the right numbers, but I believe they are right. Can you borrow? So when you buy a property, there's 5% stamp duty and legals, so it'll actually cost you $525. Can you borrow $525 on a 500 grand property? Only in America. I think they've changed that now. So the assumption here is either there's an opportunity cost of that money if you're putting cash in, or you're using your equity in your family home or your parents' home or something like that. Okay, so again, always try and de-risk it, look at the worst case scenario. So your interest bill's 37 grand, so you're roughly going to lose 11 to 17 grand. Now I've got some properties for sale tonight. How many people want to buy a property that loses 11 to 17 grand? Any takers? No, none. So why do people buy them? Because you assume it's going to have capital growth, exactly. Not necessarily in the first year or the second year, but over the long term. So what's the break-even point? What does property have to rise by for that to break even? And there's a hint on the board. Could it be 2.2 to 3.4%? So if a 500 grand property rises by 2.2%, it rises by 11 grand, but it's cost you 11 grand in cash flow. That's the break-even. Okay? Now, this is the clever thing, or this is the thought process to really get you over the hump. When you, say if you buy a brand new business, does it make a profit in the first year? For those of you in business, does it ever make a profit? For most of us it doesn't, does it? So, what do you put into a business to cash flow it for the first few years? What's the term? Beginning with W. Working capital? They still use that word? Yep. So working capital, you put money into the business because you know it's not going to make a profit for a few years. Now, the other scenario, say you've got a profit-making division and you've got a loss-making division. Does the owner of the business pay for the loss-making division from his own wages, or does he offset the two and then take the difference? Both of those are the same with property. So your capital growth is your profit-making division and your cash flow is your loss-making division. Most people are limited with how much property they can buy because how many of you have got lots of 14 grands in your bank accounts at the end of the year? and you're all well-paid accountants. Yeah? Most people don't, do they? The other thing is that effectively what we're trying to do is we're trying to use that money to offset there. So we're trying to take the capital growth to pay off the others. The other thing we're trying to do is to put working capital into the property so you don't have to take it from your wages, you can last the few years. So in the previous example, we were borrowing 525, we're now borrowing 600. Can you borrow 600 on a 500 grand property, apart from America? No. So what you're doing is you're probably borrowing 80% on the new property, so 400 grand, and you're probably taking 200 grand from your home or your other investment property. Okay. You've got an extra 75 grand, you hide it under your bed because that's safer than the banks at times. Each year you go down to the bank and you give them 14 grand, so that's the difference between the rent and the mortgage. How long will that 75 grand last you? So we need some CPA calculators, I reckon. 5 years. 5 years. I don't know, it's late. So for 5 years you could buy this property. For 5 years you don't have to spend a cent from your own wages, and it's got to rise by 2.8%.
Would the bank give it to you?
Would, let's just say, to make it easy, say you've got $1 million home that's paid off, would they lend you 200? Sure. So it depends on how much equity you've got and your serviceability, but let's just say that extreme example, say you've got $1 million or a 500 grand property paid off, they'll lend you 200 against that. Because effectively, say if you borrowed 500, you've really given them $1 million worth of property, you're only borrowing 600, so you're only really 60% geared in that example. Okay? So who reckons property might rise by 2.8% in 5 years? So about 2/3. So again, if you thought you'd do it, you do it. If you don't buy it. And what could you do if you thought it was going to take 10 years to rise by that? What could you do? Borrow more buffer. So what if you borrowed 700 grand? Your break even would rise to maybe 3.5, but do you reckon property might rise by 3.5% in 10 to 15 years? And so that's all it is. It's basically some scales. The more worried you are, borrow more money. So it's actually safer to be more in debt than less in debt. Because you see in this position here, you've got no buffer, you lose your job, you lose the property. In this situation, you lose your job, you've still got 5 years to get another job. Okay? Again, it takes a bit of time to get your head around it, but effectively, that's the philosophy. Has anyone got any questions on that? Because that really does go against the way we kind of our minds are set. So that if you don't get this, don't feel embarrassed, because quite often what I find is the more intelligent you are, the longer it takes. So if you got it straight away, I'm sorry, you're not very clever. No, honestly, it does. So we have a lot of CFOs. And the thing is, because it's so ingrained in you to pay off debt, and debt's a bad thing, which it is a dangerous thing, it is, but it goes against the grain not to go and pay it off. Does that make sense? Yeah? Let's move over that. This we actually haven't got anymore, but basically, if you go into Excel, the biggest thing that I've done is effectively buy property at 22. Because even though now buying one a week or two a week is much, my knowledge is much better than when I was buying one every 3 or 4 years, as you can imagine. Doing $10 million of renovations now per year versus me doing maybe $1,000 when I was 22, I know a hell of a lot more. But the most money I've made is from buying at 22. And people say the UK is staffed and it's really bad over there, but my property has gone from £80,000 to 160 to 320 to maybe 350, maybe now back to 330, 340. It's still doubled and doubled again. And it's still rented out, and my rent keeps going up, and it's positive cash flow. So when you hear all these stories in the media, it's the media. The first thing I can teach you is don't listen to the media. Don't read the papers, don't listen to your friends and family. And I said this to the CEO of Sky. I said on my show, I said, don't tune in. You don't need to tune in every year because nothing changes. So tune in tonight, read my book, tune in next year. Apparently it doesn't go well for ratings and stuff like that, which is a bit of an issue. But I'm into telling the truth, and that's the way we say it. In the wealth creation industry, most people say don't listen to the media. It's all negative. It's all going to depress you, and then you never do anything because you're too worried about what your friends and family are saying. And it's hard to change your family at times. It costs a lot of money with the lawyers and the rest of it. But quite often it's easier to change your friends. And you have your friends that you just have fun with, and you have friends that maybe you listen to and you kind of hang out with. So let me take you through a couple of examples of the kind of things that we typically buy all the time to give you an idea, and then we can have some questions and get into some other numbers and stuff, and remind me to tell you about why I don't buy as well. So typically we're trying to buy the ugly duckling. When you buy something gleaming new, whether it's a house or whatever else, developers charge you a premium. They're professional sellers, they're never going to sell it cheap. Even if they're going down the gurgler, the chances are you're never really going to get a deal. All this off the plan stuff, in the old days you get it for a real discount. These days it's all hyped up for investment stuff. Most of the time it's not. So if you're buying off mum and dad, we're not trying to steal it from mum and dad, but mum and dad aren't going to pay for the best agent, they're not going to style it, they're not going to renovate it, so you get a reasonable property for a reasonable kind of figure. That's what we're trying to get. Because the most important thing's not the price you pay, it's getting the right property in the right location that ticks all the boxes. That's the most important thing. Because within 4 to 6 weeks and about 10% of the property value, you can transform it into that, which almost looks like a computer picture, but it is actually a real picture. That's what kind of brand new looks like. And obviously you can see it's a lot easier to fall in love with that than obviously that. Obviously a nice bathroom to something like that. So no, these numbers are actually a tiny bit out of date. So typically what we'd normally do is we'd probably buy around 600 grand, 6 to 900 grand, so the median price for Sydney. We'd generally put about 10% in there, so about 60 or 70 grand, and we'd generally hope that it's gone up by, say, roughly 100 to 120. So this is probably a few years old, but again, 6 weeks, so instantaneously. Now, quick thing here is I just look at 2-bedroom units. I've looked at the same suburbs for the last 10 years. In a good week, I'd see 10 properties. 50 weeks, that's 500 properties a year for the last 10 years. How well do you reckon I know 2-bedroom units in the eastern suburbs in Sydney? Do you reckon I roughly know what they're worth? Do you reckon I'd spend 500 or 600 bucks on an independent valuation to see what the figure is? Every single time I buy, and a building inspection and a strata inspection. Most of the public don't, because they're cleverer than me. So every single time I buy, before I even put a number on a contract, valuation, building, strata, 1,300 bucks. Because if you miss something on a 500 or 600 grand property and you're a few percent out, how much is that worth? You go and do a strata, there's lots of strata buildings in our areas now, 100 grand special levies per unit. So you imagine spending 600 on a unit, the next day you get something in the mail, can you give us 100 grand, we need it in 2 weeks' time. And because the stratas have hidden it, because they know someone's selling, and then they put it into place the next day. So this is what I'm talking about, spending money. You've got to spend money to make money, okay? So again, in this example, then we're putting 50 grand in, but effectively we're doubling that money virtually overnight. How do you know you're going to guarantee to double your money overnight? Is there any way of knowing that until afterwards? Yeah. So what you do is you get your valuer to say, what's it worth now? What's it worth when it's all fully renovated? What's it going to be worth when it's brand new? And he goes and compares it. So he goes to us and says, look, I think the property's worth now is 500 grand and it's worth 560 afterwards. That's the way we know. So we're not into taking risks and trying to speculate on the market. We're going for guarantees. We're getting a bank valuation to say, I believe it's worth 560 after we've done the renovation. We then go to our builder and say, right, you quoted us 50 grand. We want that guaranteed to the cent, to the day, otherwise you pay penalties. Does that sound like speculating and taking a risk in the property market? So whether the market moves or not, we know we've made that 50 grand pretty much straight away. And then taking a rent from 3.6 to 5.35. 5.35 in Sydney is pretty good money, pretty good rent. And in terms of, I'll tell you about the buyer's agents again, the spending kind of thing, because what I was trying to explain before, I was talking about the cleaner, of outsourcing to the cleaner and paying money for getting your deliveries done. If you're not willing to spend 20 or 30 bucks, you're never going to spend 10 grand or 100 grand. And that's where the money is. Because effectively what we're our buyer's agents. We don't do it in Brisbane, but if you look in Yellow Pages or Google, there'll be local buyer's agents. So they're like us. They may be buying 1 or 2 a week. how well do you think a buyer's agent's going to buy compared to the public that are buying maybe once every few years? Generally, they're going to have better contacts with the agents versus the general public. So typically a buyer's agent will charge you about 2 or 3%, so around 15 grand. And if you get them to manage a renovation, so on a 50 grand reno, they might charge like 15%, so about 8 grand. So in all, it's 23 grand. So people would say, why would you pay someone 23 grand to buy and renovate a property for you when you can do it yourself? Good question. But what if they go and get you a deal like that they make 50 grand straight away, versus you go in and buy something that's gleaming straight away and maybe even pay 600 for it? So the whole idea on wealth creation for my parents is trying to make money from saving money, whereas I think the new generation now is not about how much money you're spending, it's the big picture is what's the net benefit to you. Okay? So in this example, it's cost you 23, but after your profit of 50, you're still net up 27, versus most people buying the wrong properties and overpaying and not being in the right kind of areas. I'll show you this other one. This is, I told you I was an accountant and didn't have the most emotion. This is what I romantically did on my anniversary while we were boating in Italy, and my wife swore she saw a dolphin or a shark or something else in the water, and I said, no, I'm just trying to close this deal at the moment. We bought a block of units. So bought this block of units for 1.9 million in Coogee, so just down from Bondi, and converted it to this in 4 months. We bought it for 1.9. We put 600 grand into it to renovate it, so it cost 2.5 million. 4 months later, the bank revalued at 3.5 million, so $1 million profit in 4 months, and I probably only even owned it for 2 months of that. So making $1 million in 4 months is obviously a pretty good thing. Can anyone see what the really clever thing is from those numbers at the bottom?
The finance off the final valuation.
Yeah. So effectively what we've done is, I've effectively paid out 2.5 million. I've then gone to the bank and said, right, that's worth 3.5 million. Lend me 80%, which is reasonably normal. They've lent me 2.8 million. So I've basically paid back the 2.5 million that I've paid, so I've got no money in the deal, and they've given me 300 grand in cash. So I bought a block of units for effectively no money. They've given me 300 grand in cash, which is effectively 3 years of buffer. Again, the cost of getting a buyer's agent to do that would be 2% on the 1.9 million, so 38 grand, and 90 grand to manage the reno, 130 grand. Would you pay 130 grand to make $1 million? Reasonable bet now, isn't it, in hindsight? But what about looking forward? If I came to you with that deal and said, pay me 130 and I'll do this, is it the same as seeing it afterwards? It's not, is it? Because could that change? Could that go wrong? Yeah. And this is the problem is, for a lot of people, is you won't spend the money until you get the guarantees, which is why no one typically does anything. So two final things I'll end on is, when I was at Deloitte's, I paid 15 grand to go on a wealth creation course, learning about this kind of stuff. All of my colleagues said, why would you spend 15 grand to go on a property course? Like 15 grand, I didn't have it, so I put it on credit cards. And they said, you're mad. But I said, well, Deloitte's ever paid me to go on a course to retire from Deloitte's? Are they ever going to do it? Like, I mean, they're reasonably clever at Deloitte's, aren't they? I mean, they're not that stupid. They're not going to do it. And the hindsight was I couldn't afford that 15 grand, whereas effectively in hindsight now, to have from 31 to 65 reasonably free to do what you want, what's that worth? Millions? Tens of millions? It's a small price. In hindsight, you'd pay 100 grand, wouldn't you? Or even 200 grand. But it's paying it up front, that's the hardest thing. Now, just to go back on the renting thing, so obviously I'm an advocate of property, aren't I? Got around 10 or 11 million of property of these kind of properties. Why would I want to rent rather than live in my own home? Yep.
Well, you can live somewhere where you really want to, and you're paying for lifestyle, really.
So that's kind of half of it. So most people can't afford to live in the suburbs they want to live in, can they? Yeah, even at the top end, no matter how rich people are, most people kind of want something else. So that's half of it. But there's a numbers thing. There's a numbers thing of why I do it. So I've got 10 or 11 million of all sub-$1 million properties. And I rent anywhere from $3, $6, $7 million properties. What's the difference between a 600 grand property and a $6 million one? How many people queue up for 600 grand properties? Lots of people, yeah? What happens to the rent with the competition? Goes up. How many people can afford to rent $6 million properties? For the people that can afford to rent $6 million properties, what do? They buy them, don't they? So is that even less people want them? What happens to the price? Goes down. So effectively, the equation is when I rent my properties out, I get roughly 4 to 6% rent returns. When I'm renting myself, I pay between 1.5% and 2.5%. So for the same price that I could buy a $1.5 million house, which in Sydney doesn't get you a lot, I can tell you it gets you a unit, I can live in a $6 million house and probably still save some money on tax. So how much comfort does it give you being in your own house? Now, if you don't pay the mortgage, what's the bank going to do? Repossess. If I was living in a $6 million house, how hard would it be to sell it now? If I give a month's notice, I'm out, clear, no hassles. So suddenly I've got all of my assets working really, really hard with lots of competition so that even in the GFC they don't drop a single cent. And then I go and rent these expensive houses that people can't afford, and the rent goes down, they can't sell them, and they get even more desperate, and the price is cheaper and cheaper. So when people look at me and say, you're so poor because you still rent, do you reckon I have sleepless nights? No. The same thing I do with cars. So there used to be a club called the P1 Club, the Supercar Club, and there's other clubs now. You can have $10 million worth of cars, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, all the rest of it, for around 10 or 20 grand. Why would you ever own those cars? Especially a Lamborghini could be $1 million, will cost you 200 or 300 grand a year when you can go and rent it for $1,000 a day. If you see a Lamborghini, do you say, look at that poor guy in that Lamborghini? That $1 million Lamborghini, he can't afford to buy it, he's renting it. You're still dribbling for the guy thing. Okay. I guess the main things that I was trying to get across, and we've still got some time for questions, is, look, even though we're talking about money here, the biggest thing that I'm trying to stand for is freedom and choice. I believe the biggest thing that you can get by having money is the choice that what you want to do, whether you work, whether you play, whether you spend time with your kids, whether you do charity and the rest of it, even if you're not material, and I didn't come from a material background from my parents, is it gives you choice of what you want to do. And I think you only get one life, and I've had lots of friends with cancers and the rest of it in their late 30s, and they don't get a second chance. And so I say, whatever you're going to do, make sure you've only got one life, make the most of it. A lot of today is talking about debt. A lot of our clients pay cash. So where I'm talking about gearing 100% here, it's just to give you the worst case scenario. You can do exactly the same paying in cash, and the numbers are exactly the same. Okay? So don't think of me as the debt guy, even though I do use debt. I use it very, very safely. I do take risks, but they're all very, very calculated kind of risks. Okay? But the biggest thing is, even though we can tell you stories, and if you Google articles and videos and the rest are on the website, we'll teach you what to buy, where to buy, all that kind of stuff. All that stuff is easy. And so if you come for that, I can certainly ask you questions later, but honestly, that's the easy stuff. If you can get your mindset around this stuff here, that's where you make millions of dollars. Okay? And so roughly my portfolio, if it rises roughly at 5 or 10% a year, it's $500,000 to $1 million a year. I don't pay tax on it because I'm just refinancing the equity out rather than selling property. That's where the money is. Earning money from running a business, $250,000, $500,000, it's insignificant. The money is in holding assets. That's where real cash is. And again, you can use this on shares or business or whatever else. Okay, so I hope that's confused you. I'm hoping that you're all going to have sleepless nights and you can't think about it. Just as a reminder, with the book, if you didn't get a book, there's a few still on the front rows. Go to yourempire.com.au. You can download it for free, audiobook, PDF, or for the price of a stamp. We'll send it to you, or just send me an email and we'll send it to you. But any questions whatsoever on what we've covered or what maybe we've missed?
Just on bank valuations, we found recently that the banks have got really, really tough on their valuations when they're looking at property.
The big thing is, for most people, the banks tell them what it's worth. We tell the banks what it's worth. So it's doing the opposite. So quite often people will get bank valuations. The valuer will come in, he'll be from out of town, he's paid $200, he probably won't even turn up, they'll do a computer valuation. If you've got a really dodgy property, insist on a computer valuation. If you've got a good property, you've got to insist they come in. If you spend 100 grand on a renovation, you've got a much better view. They can't tell that from a computer. So at NAB, when they refinanced all of mine, I said, no, you need to do a full valuation. I increased it 10%. So 10 million went to 11 million. I've moved them 20% before. The easy way to do it is spend half a day researching. Go around, look at all the properties in your suburb, know what's comparable, look at the pros and cons, track all the prices. And this is what I had to do at an early age. I was more involved. Now I just pay my own valuer, say, right, I want this to boost the bank valuation. I'll pay you $500, give me all the higher comparables. I'll put those on a list and I'll give it to the other valuer. So again, if your time is worth $500 for half a day, then do it yourself. If your time's more precious, go and pay $500, because if you get an extra 10% on, say, a 500 grand property, they lend you 80% of that, you've raised 40 grand in cash. I don't mind spending $500 on my own valuation to raise 40 grand. That's time well spent. Yeah, so generally I used to use a lot, and especially in the days when I was in Deloitte, there was low doc loans and no doc loans. And the whole idea is you don't want to stand out from the crowd. You want to be a number, because generally in residential, as long as you pay your mortgage, they're never going to margin call you. They can margin call you, it is in the bank contracts, but they're very, very unlikely to. And my philosophy is they're always going to go after the people 95% geared, and then 90, and then 85 and 80. So at 80%, it's seen as reasonably secure, as long as you can pay your mortgage. What I got to a stage now is, for some reason, the banks wanted me to show an income and serviceability to have $7 or $8 million in loans. And technically, I hadn't earned any money for 10 years. And so I had a bit of a problem. So I then went to one bank who then spent 6 months with Deloitte trying to understand me as a business rather than as a normal person. Because I told them my mum said I'm not normal, and so they treat me differently. And it took that long to get them to understand me as a one-off case. And now I'm popping a few clients in that are doing the same thing. So I actually had lunch with the bank, and after they lent me the 7 or 8 million, they said, we need to have a chat about how you're going to pay it back. And I said, no, this is the really clever thing. You actually don't want me to pay it back, and let me show you how. And they were paying for lunch. Because I said, look, if you want me to reduce my debt by $1 million, I've got to earn $2 million, pay $1 million in tax, and pay off my mortgage. But if I wait for my properties to rise in value, effectively my gearing goes from 80% to 70%. And I don't pay any tax, I don't have to go out to work, and we're all happy. Because if I reduce my gearing to 70%, they're only going to lend me the money the next year anyway. And they actually accepted that. So you don't have to pay the money back. And so the whole idea is now, say my portfolio is, say, 10 or 11 mil, the debt's around 7 or 8. If I stop buying now and do nothing, in roughly 10 years, the asset base should be 20 million. I'm then only 7 million in debt, or maybe 8 million, 40% geared, which is then positive cash flow, net worth of 12 million, 20 million rising at roughly by 1 or 2 million a year. And that should be enough to live off. Being sarcastic. Yeah. So again, can you see that's completely contrary to you walking into your bank and saying, yeah, get a P&I loan, pay it off as quick as you can? Because they just lend you the money the next day. So I go to my bank every year and I just refinance every year, pull the equity out, use some for me, some for buffer, some for refinancing. But the downside is if current affair comes knocking, or if I'm front page on the paper, they'll massacre me straight away. So that's why I go on current affair and Today Tonight to be on the nice side, so they never come around and hopefully do the nasty side. But that is the danger. But I think once I've got through that 2 or 3 year period and down to 60% gearing, I'll then maybe diversify across all the banks. Yep.
You purchase properties in structures?
Yeah. So I started off by buying in my own name, because I don't think structures were invented in those days. But now typically everything's through a structure. The main reason is asset protection, because I could be sued. And even if you haven't got a suable job, if you've then got money, people will sue you. And supposedly it's easier to transfer profits and losses and capital gains and all the rest of it. The downside, obviously, it costs you money. But again, in the grand scheme of things, a few grand to an accountant, and they're nice people to pay money to, keep the profession going. Yeah, most of the time I put it in that. But some of our advisors say if you're a typical employee, you're fairly young probably, or near retirement, probably don't bother. And again, I don't know the ins and outs of trusts and structures and the rest of it. Like, I failed tax 3 times. I went to a third-tier accounting firm. They set up a trust. Went to Deloitte Private. They've got full-time people that do that 24/7, and they said, "Oh, you need to do this, this, and this," and like, you're not going to understand it, and I wouldn't waste any time understanding it. Go to the best advisor you can afford, and get them to do it. So a lot of people say, "Why would you go to a Big Four as a personal?" They say, "Oh, they charge big bucks," but I see my accountants as people that make me money now rather than cost me money. So I put them in to negotiate with the bank, pay them 10 grand, but they give me another 200 grand. That gives me another 2 million of property that I make 500 grand on. To pay them 10 grand, it's peanuts. So again, it's trying to get out of the mindset of saving that money, pay the good guys the money, and they'll make you the money if you pay the right people. Yeah.
So my brief understanding of how it works is you don't have a regular income, but you use some of the lendings to pay off the mortgage. And are there times where the house kind of plateaus for 5 or 7 years and it doesn't grow, and you almost kind of run out of your debt to repay the mortgage?
Yep, 100%. So effectively, the difference between my rent and the mortgage at the moment might be 200 or 300 grand a year, depending on interest. So before I get out of bed, I've already lost 200 or 300 grand, and I've still got to eat and pay for feed the kids and all that kind of stuff. And so effectively, I'm using equity for that. And so, yes, if properties plateau, and they plateau for long enough, then I need to build the equity, or I need to get a job and some money, God forbid. And so that's effectively the downside. So here where we're doing it and you're losing like 14 grand or something, yeah, so that's obviously not too much money to find. Like if you really beg, borrow and steal, you can find it. But if you've got 10 of those properties and it's costing you 140, that's a bit of a big hole that you're digging. And so then you just got to get slightly more sophisticated. You've got to know your numbers inside out. You've got to have backup plans, all of those kind of things. The worst case scenario is most of my properties I reckon I could sell within a week or two, because they're very good properties in the right locations, well kept, good rentals and all the rest of it. So that's one of the reasons the bank will lend me 80%, because they know I'm buying the right kind of things. But worst case, yes, you're going to have to find that money. And that's why you've got to know your numbers. So in the GFC, what I did is I pulled out 750 grand of redraw and put it into a separate bank that I had no borrowings with. I was paying 10% commercial rates on that and only probably getting 4%. So it's probably costing me 40 or 50 grand a year just in the interest offset. But how comfortable do you think I felt in the GFC having 750 in cash when I was probably only losing 150 or 200 per year? So I had maybe 5 years cash there. Then as times got better, I went and spent it and I bought a couple of units. But those units effectively will make me $1 million in the next year. So even if the property market doesn't grow, they're being developed and effectively will make $1 million off that. So effectively I've doubled that money again. But I've spent all my buffer. But I just thought that $1 million's almost a guarantee. So even if I've run out of buffer and I've got to sell a property in the meantime and pay a bit of tax, the $1 million is the bigger picture. So sometimes there are reasons to sell. So now, technically we've run out of time. I'm happy to speak. It's up to you guys. Do you want to take another question here?
Yeah, I was
Yep.
just going to say on that topic, you sort of do an assessment from time to time, like I guess the market's sort of pretty flat at the moment, as to should I unload these properties or should I try and ride it out, or what's your sort of buffer range there?
Yeah, generally my investing is buy and hold forever. So if I'm buying the right property, it's always going to be good. Sure, it might go flat for 3 or 4 years, but all things do at certain times. So if you're constantly analysing it, it's going to be a nightmare. The cost of getting out and getting back in is massive, even if it's your own home and you're not paying CGT. So generally I'm not going through that all the time. The only thing is I'm doing it is if I can suddenly make super profit somewhere else. So like we've got a block of units and we've got DA to double the size. So it's going from 7 to 14. We've got a builder to pay for all the upgrade, and we turn our old units into new ones. That'll make me $1 million for doing nothing. So maybe I could offset an old unit to get into that one in that kind of extreme. But this is the difference on different strategies. I'm a really lazy, safe investor. Even though I'm highly geared and I've borrowed lots of money, I'm actually seen as safe by myself. Not bothering. Versus going and buying 200 grand properties in a mining town or way out in the middle of nowhere, because I've got no knowledge on those markets. They might hotspot, they might not, they might go flat for 10 years. To me, I think that's risky. So even though I'm big money in the rest of it, it's all calculated. And this is what all these Australian property monitors, all those guys, they all say, the safe money is median price in a city, so not in the CBD, because you can keep building these towers. As soon as you get away from, when you get height restrictions, for that commutable distance, and Brisbane may be 2 to 10 Ks, maybe, that's where all the commuters, all the rich, young professionals, look where the CPA database is, and try and target all those kind of areas and do that kind of thing. All right, I'll be around for some more questions, so if you've got anything else, and feel free. The other thing I'd say is, like, if you haven't got a social life, tune into Sky on 6:30 on a Friday, and we'll hopefully educate you on some stuff. If you've been out clubbing and the rest of it and you can't sleep at, I think, midnight, 2 and 5, tune in and I'll send you to sleep. Thank you very much.